Welcome, everyone, to the Captain's Council. This is session 7, and today we're going to talk about communication and pregame speeches, why they matter, and how they can help you to become the best team that you can be and reach your potential. So today I want to start with, as we usually do, time for you all to reflect as a team over the last couple weeks. And in particular, we want to think about your team's narrative. Is that something that you've been intentional about crafting, or is it something that you've left up to chance? And is it hurting or helping your team? So see if you can identify it. Again, have you been intentional with it? And do you feel like your narrative currently is helping or hurting your team get to the place you want it to be? The next is mental toughness, and thinking about if your team is lacking this, and then who specifically on your team might need to improve in this area to help the team improve as a whole in regards to their mental toughness. And then the third is, where can your team strategy improve? The next session is about overview of session 6, and we want to think about if you can define narrative. How does it impact your behavior? The second is, what is the difference between strategy and tactics? And the third is identifying 3 of the mental skills out of the 10 that we mentioned last session, and in particular 3 that you feel like you personally need the most work on developing. And to start, we want to look at communication. And Tony Robbins says that the quality of your life is the quality of your communication. So first, we'll start with some principles. And I think it's interesting to start with this aspect that there are 3 components or aspects of communication. The first is what you say in your head, or what you mean to say. The second is what you actually say, what comes out of your mouth. And then there's a third component, which is what the individual that you're communicating to, or the group, actually consumes or hears. And there are 3 different messages, interestingly enough, what science says, for each one of those components. And so we want to make sure there's alignment, and in particular that there is clarity through all 3 of these components. Easier said than done, but all of the things that I mentioned previously is in regards to clarity in particular, especially the journaling aspect and just being prepared, is really an important process of being able to communicate more effectively. There's a quote that says, you write to think, and then you teach to learn. And to communicate well, you have to think well. And the next thing I'd like to do is tell you a quick story that I feel like summarizes sports very well. And this was a football program, and the head coach tasked the assistant coach to teach their middle linebacker this new play. And so after a couple practices, this middle linebacker still couldn't figure out what he was supposed to do on this particular play and how he was supposed to read the situation. Couple practices turned into a couple days, which turned into a couple weeks. And at the end of the month, the head coach talked with the assistant coach and asked him, why can't our middle linebacker figure out this play? And the assistant coach says, well, I've told him 1,000 times how to go about this, and he just isn't doing it. I think he's just stupid. And the head coach looks at him and says, if you said the same thing to him 1,000 times and expected a different result, then you must be the stupid one. And I think it's a great story that we see, and I see a lot in sports, where coaches say the same thing over and over again, which can be useful if you're trying to relay a particular message. But ultimately, you should see change. There should be action on the individual's part that you're trying to communicate to, or else you need to change your approach, because we all think differently. And I think that's the highlight from the story is, and the one thing that you should take away is taking ownership of your communication skills, because ultimately it comes back to you. as the communicator to do that appropriately and properly, or to create an environment that that individual will learn best. And the third thing I wanted to point out was that there is a difference between communicating and connecting with other people, which we'll talk about next. And so when we think about connection, there are three questions I like to ask, or that the group or individual that you're communicating to needs to know. And that is that, does the person that's communicating to me, do they care for me? Can they help me? And can I trust them? I think those are three interesting questions when we think about communicating in a way that connects, that there should be a relationship there, and they should be able to answer those three questions. When I think about connecting, there are some requirements that takes. The first is energy. You'll see the quote down there that says, it doesn't take a lot of energy to say something, but it does take a lot of energy to move someone. And so if we want to connect, our communication should require energy, both into the thought and the preparation we put into what we're communicating, and then also in the communication that we give, and the way that we present it should be and should provide some energy. The second is initiative, and all great leaders initiate conversations. And so if we want to connect, 99% of the time, the people we want to communicate with and connect with are not going to initiate us. We have to initiate that conversation with them in that communication. And then finally is that it's all about selflessness. And when you communicate, you really need to think completely and totally about the other person that you're trying to communicate to. A couple quotes here, I think that wraps this up well, is that Ralph Nichols, just talks again about how important communication is to our advancement, promotion, and ultimately to how we perform as a team. Communication is important, and it is something that we should practice and be deliberate on improving upon. The second is that simplicity is the ultimate form of sophistication. I think that this summarizes communication well. If you can say anything, the shorter that you can make it, the better it usually is. And most individuals today, science says that we only have about 7 seconds. That's how long our attention span is. It's about 7 seconds. And so the shorter that we can be, the more simply that we can put what we want to communicate, the harder that is to do, and the better ultimately it is, and the increased and you get an increased ability to communicate via that method. And the last one has to do with this aspect of selflessness. John Maxwell says that you have to lose self-consciousness in order to have other consciousness. And I know a lot of people, when they get in front of people, they're really worried about them. And the only way we can really get over that is to realize that the individuals we're communicating to want us to do well. They want to be helped. And so we need to take our consciousness away from us and put it onto them. And I think that's a good way to make sure that we're able to connect and communicate both appropriately to our audiences. And so with that said, I want to get into pre-game speeches and talk about some of the, first we'll start with, is it necessary? And then talk about some principles that you can use to help you go about these effectively. And so science says, there's some differing opinion. If you've read the captain's class, one of the traits that Sam Walker talks about is all of them have these great team captains have a low-key, practical and democratic communication style. Most of them did not give, these rah speeches. And then on the other hand, there's some other science that's been done. We had Dr. Vargas Tonsing on our podcast, and some of her work, showed that verbal persuasion, as she called it, said that are like pregame, halftime, post-game speeches do influence an athlete's sense of self-efficacy, or just efficacy in general. And many athletes, a large percentage of them, say they either enjoy or that it improves the performance of the team and the individual. So there's a bit of a dichotomy there. And so what I want to present you with is just 4 questions that you should be able to ask that when I ask these questions, it does drive me to the answer that this pregame speech is necessary, and it's useful for developing just skills that we want to have within our life. And so the first one is, what's the purpose of sports? The second is, will it improve your skill set? Like if you go through this process, you get out of your comfort zone, and you try to motivate individuals, all a very difficult thing to do. And you get some experience trying to work through that process. Do you develop a valuable skill at the end of it? The third is, does it affect performance? If you don't think it is if you think it does, then it should promote the fact that you do it. If you don't think it really helps or hurts, then I would say there's no real harm in you trying to make this part of your process. And fourth is very similar. Do you feel like it has an effect on team cohesion? And one more thing is that this idea of vulnerability is a key aspect that I think drives or allows us to measure the amount of buy-in that's within a program. And so for both team captains and coaches here, the more vulnerable your athletes and your teammates are willing to be, the more buy-in they have for the program. Because what that means is that they value something more than themselves. And that is a key indicator of buy-in, which is great. And so what I'd like to do is, if you can pause here and discuss this in general, think about, is this necessary? Think about and ask yourselves these 4 questions in regards to deciding if this is something, if you're not already doing it within your team, if you should, or if you don't want to do it at all. So pause here and talk through this. After you had a chance to talk through this as a team, I'm hoping that you came to the conclusion that this is something that would be useful, as the purpose of sports is really for us to develop skill sets so that we can go into the world with a certain set of skills and character traits. And I think that this is a very, very fun, very scary, and a very meaningful thing for teams to do. So if you come to that conclusion as team captains, let's go through a couple of the principles that I've found in some of our research when it comes to pregame speeches. What's the type of environment and the way to approach this to do it effectively? The first is, you have to have earned the right to speak. And you've been named a team captain, so hopefully that's the case. But some people will jump up, try to give a pregame speech, and they don't really have the respect of everybody in the room, and that can go really poorly. So that's usually where I start, is making sure that you feel confident and comfortable, and that you've earned the respect of the team to be able to do so. The second is just about positioning. It doesn't necessarily have to be center stage. That's usually 90% of the time where we see the most benefit from, as you command the attention around the room. So make sure you're in the right position to do this. I've seen it happen in a corner as well, where somebody stands up on a stool and has a higher level of, a higher look to them. Just being in a center of prominence, so to speak, and positioning is important. The third has to do with this idea of, how should it flow, and realize that it's almost like a dance in many ways, that there is a rhythm that is required in a flow. If it's choppy, it usually doesn't work. If there's too long of a pause, it becomes unnatural. So flow is kind of like the cornerstone, I think. Because ultimately, I've seen a lot of pregame speeches that I have no idea what the individual said, but they were able to have a good cadence and flow with the words that they were communicating. And the second one is that they had a high level of emotion that seemed natural and naturally progressed as this pregame speech kind of moved forward. And finally was the content. If you can do all 3 of those things, you really you'll have a strong pregame speech. And right under there, I have a quote. It says that people don't care what you say. they ultimately care how you make them feel. And I think that that really epitomizes the pregame speech very well. And the next one is about feeling being more important than content. We kind of just mentioned that, but if you can do all three, that's obviously what you're shooting for. The next is this idea of confidence and remembering that your nonverbal cues communicate as well, and that is something that you should make sure that you're aware of. Start slow and build up. That's kind of goes back to this idea of flow and proper cadence. The next is that many of these go better depending on the situation, but many of them go better when you engage the whole team. So if you can start by yourself, say a few words, and then find a way to bring and engage everybody else into some sort of a chant or something like that, those usually go the best. And so if you're starting off on this, that's what I would recommend you do. Again, I just mentioned it, all of this being very situation dependent for the sport that you play and also the type of personalities that you have within the team. One of the number 9 here is, and is one of the things that I learned from experience doing these well and doing these poorly in the past in high school and college, is that this is a scary moment for many people, and it's important that you realize that your emotions are going to shoot up through the roof, and this high level of motion actually decreases clarity of your thought. And so that leads me to the last piece, is that if you're going to do this, you have to practice and prepare. When I would prepare for mine, I had this ratio of 10 things. That was a 10-to-2 ratio. So I would prepare 10 things to say that were very short and succinct. And by the time that I was in the middle of giving it and I completely blanked, I would usually, if I had 10 things, I'd remember to say 2. And so just always making sure that you have enough, that you've practiced, you've prepared, that you realize that you will probably blank as to what it is you want to say, but that's just that's the way our bodies react, and it's just an interesting phenomenon. So make sure you prepare and practice, and realize that will most likely occur. So those are the 10 principles. We have a couple videos on this if you're more interested in learning about this more on your own. And so this is the final slide here. And what I'd like you all to do is think about, if you've decided to go about this, if you haven't already, what is the plan for both your pregame, halftime speeches, and even the timeouts? And most teams do not have a plan of action for each one of these periods of time, both pre, during, timeouts, and even after for that case too. And so you should have a plan in which you are going to approach this and talk to your other team captains and think about, for the pregame speech, who's going to be in charge of that? Is that something you want to do as a group, or is it one individual and you just trade off? When it comes to halftime, how are you, do you have something, if you have something to say, when is it the best time to do that? How are you going to structure that? Because obviously the coach is going to want to communicate certain aspects of strategy and tactics that need to be communicated as well. And we want to make sure that we optimize this short amount of period that we have to both make sure that there is alignment on the adjustments that need to be made to continue to improve and adapt for the game, but also have some motivation that's provided to the team too, if need be. And so go ahead and pause there and think through those 3 things. And just to conclude, communication there's a difference between communicating and connecting with other people. And ultimately, we need to take ownership as leaders as to if what we are communicating is connecting, and that we see action stem from the words that we are providing. And then I really think that pregame speeches matter, both for the teams just from a psychological perspective for the team, And then also for the athletes that are giving these pregame speeches, it's a great opportunity for you to develop a skill. And it's very scary. And a lot of times what we need to be is we need to be courageous, and that's a skill that requires us to continuously act upon. And so the things that we're scared of doing are usually the things that we should do. So that's just something to think about. And at the end of the day, if you don't agree with the pregame speeches, absolutely think about how you are going to structure any moment of times that you have right before, during, and after games, to make sure that there's clarity and alignment for how you're going to go about communicating most effectively to your team the things that matter, so that there is, again, alignment with the team as a whole. I hope you enjoyed this session number 7, as we talked about communication and pregame speeches, and we will talk to you again for session 8.